On Tuesday, November 5th, over 160 million Americans will likely head to the polls to elect their new president. Their choice will have profound implications for pretty much everyone on the planet. We say that about every US election, but this year it feels more real than ever. Should Europe worry? Or maybe keep calm and carry on? Good evening, my name is Mateusz Mazzini, and this is Wider View. Much has been said and written about the possible second Trump presidency. European diplomats are devising strategies to Trump-proof the continent, worried that, should he win, the White House would significantly decrease its overseas commitments. In particular, their concerns center around Ukraine, as Donald Trump has promised to end the war with Russia on his first day in office. But Trump has said a lot of things over the course of his political career, much of it contradicting earlier statements. And most of the declarations have never translated into tangible results. During his first term, his foreign policy was marked by impulsiveness, chaos, and strategic shortcomings. Will the second time around be any different? We try to answer that question in our first report.
Among the many phrases that have emerged to describe a possible second Trump administration, one has proved to be particularly popular. Leading commentators have been arguing that under Trump 2.0, there will be no adults in the room. The tried and true criteria for top cabinet and White House positions will be replaced by loyalty. The Republican candidate is expected to demand complete obedience from his new team, mindful of his previous disappointments. High-ranking officials in his first administration, including Mike Pence and John Bolton, are among his fiercest critics now. Trump's demand for loyalty will lead him to search for candidates outside the diplomatic establishment. While Trump is busy on the campaign trail, a battle for his attention is raging on the sidelines. According to a recent report from the European Council on Foreign Relations, there are three groups of policymakers in play. The restrainers, led by vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance, want less America in the world. They would demand a greater focus on domestic issues, but without total isolation in foreign policy. The second group, the prioritizers, see China as the main threat to the US in the coming years. Finally, there are the primacists. They hold the traditional view on American foreign engagements and continue to see Washington as a leading global force. The ultimate makeup of the Trump administration would likely feature politicians from all three groups. But who exactly will make the cut? That's likely to remain a mystery until the very end.
The restrainers, the primacists, the prioritizers. And on top of them, the king of chaos, Donald Trump himself. It appears nearly impossible to try and predict anything about the possible second administration of Donald Trump. But there are few people in the world who have the talent to do exactly that. And I'm pleased to say I'm joined tonight by one of them, Jeremy Shapiro, Research Director at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Good evening. Jeremy, I want to begin with a more detailed breakdown of the three categories that we have just mentioned in our report. Could you give us a more comprehensive breakdown on the three tribe, in inverted commas, of foreign policy experts in the vicinity of Donald Trump right now?
I mean, I think, first of all, it needs to be said that none of them are, in a certain sense, in the very near vicinity of Donald Trump. Donald Trump has not had any foreign policy advisors on his campaign, and he doesn't really have any foreign policy people in his inner circle these days. So these camps are all in what we sort of call the broader Trump orbit. They are all attempting to support Donald Trump. They are all attempting to provide foreign policy for Donald Trump. They are certainly not attempting to contradict him in any way. But they are in a competition for Trump's mind. I think that the first camp, the primicists, are the most traditional camp, and there are a lot of people who would have been comfortable in the George W. Bush administration. They're people who believe that the United States has a critical role to play in security issues throughout the world, and particularly in the sort of three main strategic regions, which are East Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. And they really want to continue the policy of American leadership. This is the camp that is ideologically furthest from Donald Trump, but they're the camp that's most represented amongst the Congress and amongst Republican foreign policy people within Washington. The second camp is a newer group called the Prioritizers. They're typified by people like Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri or Elbridge Colby, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. And they very much view that the threat of China is the overriding challenge of our age. And they feel that American foreign policy needs to concentrate very strictly on China and needs to reduce its commitments elsewhere in the world, particularly in Europe and the Middle East, in order to build up forces and effort against China. And that's on the economic front, the military front, the strategic front. The third group are the restrainers, whom, I think is important not to sort of think about as purely isolationist, but they are people who think that the priority should be for the United States to be focused at home. They believe that the United States has a lot of problems at home and needs to deal with, and it shouldn't be spending its time intervening in policies which are rightly the concern of people abroad. And so they would like to have a much less commitment to alliances such as NATO and such as the U.S.-Japan alliance. And they would like to be much more focused on issues like trade and immigration from a foreign policy perspective that affect people in the heartland and that people in the United States are directly concerned about.
So I want to follow up on the isolationist/restrainers tribe in particular, because you are in fact quite careful in your report not to call them isolationist. Why is that the case? And a kind of second question, two in one, if you please. One of the leading restrainers is J.D. Vance, who has now officially been selected as the vice presidential candidate on the Trump ticket. How important will his persona be for a possible foreign policy direction of Trump 2.0?
Look, we don't use the term isolationist for a couple of reasons. First, because it's pejorative. It's meant in the U.S. debates, it is meant as a way of discrediting your opponents. And I don't find it useful to call people things that they don't themselves accept. But the second reason is because it's not really very accurate to describe restrainers. Restrainers are not isolationist in the sense that they are trying to cut the United States off from the world. They are very much interested in an important U.S. role in the world. They just don't think that the U.S. leadership position, such as it has traditionally been since the Second World War, is the correct foreign policy, and they want to have a foreign policy which is actually much like most other countries' foreign policy, which is aimed directly at core U.S. interests. But that doesn't mean, for example, that they don't think it's important to have a navy that can defend trading lines around the world. It doesn't mean that they don't think that we should have diplomatic relations with all sorts of countries. It doesn't mean that they don't think the United States should be a trading nation with important interests abroad. So I think this is an important distinction which is worth preserving.
And where does, sorry to interrupt you, where does J.D. Vance fit into that puzzle?
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult to say. I think when we wrote the report, we characterized him as a restrainer. He has since, and I think we're seeing this generally, he has since reached a sort of accord with the prioritizers. The China issue is an issue on which restrainers and prioritizers can find compromise, because if you think about it, the prioritizers are saying we should concentrate on China and get out of Europe and the Middle East. The restrainers are saying we should concentrate on America and get out of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. And so, as step one, I think the restrainers would be pretty happy with reducing commitments to Europe and the Middle East. And so there is a sort of tacit alliance a lot of times between restrainers and prioritizers. And J.D. Vance seems to be part of that. I think the bigger question is just what kind of an influence he will have on Donald Trump. The vice presidency is a strange position. It's a bit of a pulpit, but you don't really have any power of your own. And Trump has been traditionally quite difficult to influence from that position. You only have the power really that the president gives you. And I guess we just don't know at the moment whether Trump is going to give him any power if they're elected. And we don't really know whether he will allow him to have much influence over foreign policy.
So all things considered, given quite a few novelties compared to the previous administration of Donald Trump, we have a much less experienced possible vice president, an emphasis on loyalty in the recruitment process. What's going to be different compared to the previous term in the White House, obviously in foreign policy?
Yeah, I think that the main thing will be different is less the policies themselves than their capacity to implement them. Donald Trump threatened and even decided to withdraw from NATO a couple of times during his term. It didn't happen because there were the so-called adults in the room who essentially stymied his capacity to influence, to do that policy. He also felt quite stymied by the civil service. So his main effort, it seems, this term will be to find people who are both loyal enough and competent enough to implement whatever crazy plan he comes up with. And so I think all of the sort of craziness that you saw during his first term, which never ended up being translated into policy, I think you'll still see similar craziness, but you will see it's much more likely to be translated into policy. And so implementation, loyalty, bureaucratic competence, those are going to be what is different rather than specific policies.
So I guess we all know we could talk for hours about this unique universe of Donald Trump and his acolytes. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for your insights into the Republican camp. But we, of course, know that Donald Trump is only one of the two leading candidates in the run-up to the presidential elections. So now let's take a closer look at foreign policy priorities of the Harris and Waltz ticket. It's been only 4 weeks since Joe Biden dropped out from the presidential race. He was replaced by Kamala Harris, a politician whose domestic policies are well known to American voters. But what will be the key items on her foreign policy agenda? And how important in that regard will be Tim Walz, her running mate? We explore all these topics in our next report.
I will not be the last.
During her 4 years as vice president, Kamala Harris has often been criticized for her perceived inefficiency. Her opponents pointed out a lack of tangible successes in the policy portfolio she was given. Most notably, Harris was tasked with tackling the root causes of the US's illegal migration crisis. But her efforts had little impact on this complex landscape. In her defense, it is doubtful that anybody could do any better, especially without a working majority in Congress. Outside of the country, she managed to present herself as a staunch supporter of Ukraine. She represented the Biden administration at some of the main international forums, including the Munich Security Conference. Compared to her boss, Harris holds slightly different positions on some foreign policy questions. She is less decisively pro-Israel in the ongoing conflict in Gaza. On numerous occasions, she stressed the importance of humanitarian help and the tragedy of civilian deaths. This might help her win support, especially from younger voters. Her running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, also pledged support to Kyiv. He has a keen interest in Asian affairs and speaks fluent Mandarin. Minnesota is home to a large number of Americans with Scandinavian roots, and Walz maintains good relations with the Nordic countries. He even trained in Norway during his service in the National Guard. A Harris-Waltz administration would therefore continue partnering with Europe against Russia.
We win!
But China would be equally important. It's probably the only foreign policy area where Republicans and Democrats have reached a consensus.
Jeremy, sort of mirroring our questions in that regard, what do we know so far about possible priorities in foreign policy of the Harris and Waltz duo? And in which aspects will actually Kamala Harris have to or try to differ from Joe Biden in how she exercises foreign policy?
Quite a lot about her priorities because they are the priorities of the Biden administration. She has been Biden's vice president. She has been present at the formation of his foreign policy. She's been part of the formation of his foreign policy. And we don't have any sense that she has been a significant dissenter on any of the key foreign policy issues. She has not repudiated any of them, and she has associated herself by and large with, entirely with all of his foreign policy. That's quite normal for a vice president. And it's a little bit difficult to assess whether she really means it, but we don't have any indication that she doesn't, and we have occasionally in the past with other vice presidents. I would say in terms of differentiating herself, I think that there is some effort to create a little bit of differentiation, but it's less on a policy line than it is on tone. I think your report talked a little bit about her having a different approach to the Palestinian problem than Biden or the Biden administration. I'm not so sure that that's right. I think that she has struck a different tone there, but she hasn't really offered a different policy, and I don't think that she wants to. I think that President Biden very much tried to strike a tone of saying we don't support everything the Israeli government is doing. We are trying to bring a ceasefire, and we are trying to have sympathy with the suffering of the Palestinian people. But he wasn't very good at articulating that message, particularly the last part of that message. And I think she's been somewhat better at that, particularly in the last 4 weeks, at conveying the sympathy that's always been present in the Biden administration's approach to the Palestinian people. And so I think that tone has been noticed, but I don't think that it has many policy implications.
And what about Tim Walz? Because he's a relatively new face, especially for the European public. Will he have anything to say, anything to contribute with in crafting a possible foreign policy of a next Democratic administration?
Well, it's the usual vice presidential question, right? He will only have the influence and the space to do things that a President Harris would give him. And we don't know a lot. As the Minnesota governor, that's not abnormal. We don't know a lot about his foreign policy views and preferences, even though he has had quite a bit of international experience, as your report noted. I think what we can say is that Vice President Harris selected him for different reasons than Donald Trump selected J.D. Vance. In the final run-up to her choice, she was very interested, from all reports, in someone that she could work with, in someone that she could trust, in someone that she had sort of camaraderie and chemistry with. And to me, that implies that she's likely to give him quite a lot of leash, and she's likely to put him in charge of some key portfolios, as Democratic presidents often have with their vice president. So it would be natural, for example, if she delegated to him a lot of the China portfolio, given the expertise that he has. I think we're likely to see not exactly differences, but delegation to certain key areas to a guy who she feels very comfortable with, whom she is likely to trust, and who has perhaps somewhat different expertise than she has in a few different issues.
So let's talk about China a little more, because it's often said that the foreign policy towards Beijing of the Biden government was a continuation of the foreign policy towards Beijing of the Trump government. Is that actually accurate an assessment, in your opinion? And should Harris and Walz actually win the election, what would be Harris's position on China? Would there be a bipartisan consensus, as it is believed to exist right now, or would there be a shift, you think?
Look, I think in broad terms, the statement is fair that there is a degree of bipartisan consensus on China in Washington, particularly relative to almost any other foreign policy issue you can name. So that is important, and there is a sort of broad view that China is the principal challenge of the 21st century, that the U.S. needs to devote a lot more resources to it, that it's both an economic, strategic, and technological challenge. Having said that, I think that there were important differences between the Trump administration's policy toward China and the Biden administration's policy, particularly in the sense that the Trump administration was much more focused on the trade deficit and the military balance in East Asia, whereas the Biden administration has had a much more sophisticated policy of thinking about how China's technological development affects both the military and economic balance between China and the United States. And it has been come up with a lot of policies, particularly the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, that are a new form of strategic industrial policy, which is meant to both stimulate the U.S. economy, but also to make it less dependent on China and more capable of winning the military competition with China. So I'm not sure that a Trump administration would continue that, but a Harris administration certainly would. And what the Biden administration, I think, has done is formulate a quite sophisticated long-term semi-containment policy, if you will, toward China, which I'm not sure a Trump administration would be either willing or capable to continue.
So let's also circle back for a little while to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. How important is this going to be for Harris on the campaign trail? Because we're holding this interview during the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. We know there are some protests taking place outside the venue in Chicago related to the US continued support towards Israel. If she really comes across, especially to the younger voters, as somebody that has a slightly more humanitarian position in that conflict, would that make a difference with regard to the outcome of the election in November, you think?
The election is so close that pretty much anything you could name could conceivably make a difference. So the answer is yes, but the answer would have been yes for any of those questions that you asked. I think that it's important for Harris to tamp down the Palestinian issue, to remove some of the emotion from it, because it's quite divisive in the Democratic Party. It has less to do with divides between Democrats and Republicans than inter-democratic divides. And we're seeing that in the protests at the convention. And I think that there is a little bit of a worry that it will turn off certain key constituencies, particularly, for example, Arab constituencies in Michigan and youth constituencies throughout the U.S., and that it would be very advantageous for Democratic turnout, for Democratic enthusiasm, for Democratic unity to take some of the heat out of this issue, to achieve a ceasefire in the next few weeks, and by and large to sort of create a more balanced approach. I think she's already been fairly successful at that, but it remains a challenge. And I do think that it is something that they're going to be working very hard on, but it's probably not, I think it needs to be said, it's not an overriding issue in the election. It just affects some pretty, let's say, important Democratic constituencies that she would like to nail down.
Well, there's a lot more that's going to happen in the ongoing US presidential race. There's a lot more to analyze, and there's a lot more to talk about. And I'm pretty sure we will be coming back to this topic in the coming weeks and months. But that's it from us tonight. Jeremy Shapiro, Research Director, European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Whatever the outcome of the next US presidential election, its consequences will be likely felt around the world. What's more, this year's race is expected to be particularly tight. That is why everyone, including European leaders, diplomats and policymakers, has to be equally prepared for many different scenarios, even ones that appear to be impossible to predict or anticipate. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, we take our show on the road for the first time. We'll be broadcasting from Forum Albach, one of Europe's most important foreign policy conferences. See you next week.